Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night workshop. This evening, my topic is Contemplating Our Mortality. When I was doing some research for this workshop, I actually was scanning through some YouTube videos. I was doing death and whatnot. And it's amazing to me that many of the ones I found pertaining to death are scary, or they're designed to be scary. So there's ghosts and graveyards, and everything's always happening in the dark, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I think that we have a fascination with being afraid of death. Of course, you know, Hollywood has probably done its great job of sensationalizing the idea of death and the fear that goes to death. If you were to type in, as a matter of fact, if you were to type in the word death in your Google search engine, your screen will be filled up with pictures of the Grim Reaper with the sickle and the graveyards and ghosts and skulls and eerie looking demented monsters, and the zombie phase, of course, naturally comes into play there. So to me, when I see all these images, I think, well, is it any wonder why people are afraid of death? And you would be surprised that a large number of people are afraid of death. Some people won't even talk about death. They don't want to plan it. They go along the lines, oh no, I want to be happy and think about happy thoughts. And naturally, that's a good thing. However, we have to recognize that death is also part of life. They're equally balanced. So according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they suggest that we should learn to embrace death as well as be assistance to those who are dying. The number one thing they say is to be honest. If somebody's dying and they ask you, am I dying? Yes, tell them you're dying. It's typical practice to instill false hope. Oh, no, everything's fine. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with hope, but if you know death is inevitable, it's better to the person to know that they're dying. I remember when my grandma was very close to death. I didn't make it to New York, I couldn't, but what we did is I Skyped with her, so FaceTime, she could see me. And I had a conversation with her. I said, Grandma, do you see Grandpa? Oh yeah, Grandpa comes and sees me every day. Now my grandpa had died some 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Anyway, when I spoke to her about that, she knew she was dying. I never wanted to give her the understanding that she wasn't. I would just say, honey, go with Grandpa. If Grandpa's telling you to go with him, go. And she'd say, yeah, Grandpa wants me to go. Grandpa wants me to go. Go with him. And somehow by giving her that confirmation, my brother was with her. It was like a day later, my brother kept saying the same thing. Go with him. Grandpa's coming. Go with Grandpa. It's okay. You can go. And sure enough, she left very quietly and peacefully. From what I understand, she just simply rolled over, closed her eyes, and went to sleep. And that was it. Well, not went to sleep, but she ended up passing on. So I think that it's very important for us to be very honest when it comes to death. Throughout history, there have been many great philosophers and religious leaders, spiritual leaders, who speak about contemplating death. And they don't mean it in a obsessive, morbid venue. I think they're talking about the idea of the knowledge of recognizing we have a limited life, which I think is true. So I found a couple of quotes on death. I wanted to pass these on. Of course, one quote that George was very famous for was he always used to say, befriend death. Therefore, when death comes knocking at your door, it's as if you're greeting an old friend. That's what he used to say. I have another quote by Michelangelo. Death and love are the two wings that bear the good man to heaven. It's nice. Then Khalil Gibran, the poet, said, for life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't remember the gentleman's name at this time, but he talked about how do you know the difference between the drop of water and the sea? Or a wave and the ocean. It's all one, it's all connected. And then of course the last person I have is Leonardo da Vinci. He said, well, I thought that I was learning how to live. I have been learning how to die, which I find beautiful. All of these quotes I think are beautiful. If you've studied with Torquem Saradarium, or if you know of Torquem Saradarium, he was an ageless wisdom teacher that lived up in Sedona. He's written hundreds of books. He was very adamant about having his students contemplate death on a daily basis. Again, not as a morbid mindset, but the idea is to come to peace with death and recognizing our in our finite life gives us the ability to burn more brightly. We take things less seriously. We worry less, love more, engage in life more, embrace our loved ones more when we know that there's a shorter time span. Of course, many of you have known stories of families when they have a member who's dying, everyone comes together, bygones are bygones, we focus on love and supporting one another. So death is part of life and life is part of death. The two go hand in hand. They're inseparable. So if you understand the principle of polarity, one of the hermetic, I'm having trouble speaking today, I'm sorry. One of the hermetic principles is the principle of polarity, meaning that there's two extremes. Easy example, if we think about cold and hot, those are extremes. The median in which they travel is temperature, but the extremes are cold and hot. So those are the two extremes of one medium, which is temperature. If I substitute the words, we could put life and death, or existence and non-existence. Both of those exist. Now, just like cold and hot represent temperature, what would be the medium of life and death, or existence and non-existence? Well, I believe they both pertain to our physical realm. Life, when we're born into the physical realm, and death, when we leave the physical realm. So I think that life and death are a variation of the physical realm, our soul's expression, our spirit, whatever you wish to call it. I feel like that's probably a good definition of what exactly life and death deals with. Now, Torquem, he defined life as freedom of spirit, expression, and continuity of consciousness. So he connected life with consciousness. He connects death with all of the things that separate and create identification. I really like this. The idea that death means I lose my identity. In other words, when this physical existence no longer exists, the entity, the identification of Anne-Marie Geyer will be gone. It no longer exists. Just like we could say Maria Montessori no longer exists, George Washington no longer exists. Their identity has passed on. It doesn't mean that the person, the soul, it's just the physical identity. I really like that definition of the idea of death. He also continues on that death is the ever-changing process of forms, which I completely agree. I remember early on in the years of Omega when I first came in, we used to tell the story of a supernova. I used to say the word supernova, or I'd say supernova. No, it'd be supernova is the way I used to say it. You probably didn't need to know that. Anyway, the idea of a supernova is when we look up in the sky, I think it was in 1989 was the last one, when we look up in the sky, all of a sudden one night there's a star and the next night it's gone. Well, that's because a supernova had happened, which is an explosion, the death of a star. So the light stops traveling. So when a star dies, naturally, the light at the speed of light travels through the universe and eventually it no longer exists. That is death. So it's a form, it's a transition of form. Scientists say that the planet Earth was created out of the Big Bang, or the universe, was the Big Bang. Something exploded and died to create form here. Anybody knows if you've ever done a planting of in a garden? I have a brown thumb, not a green thumb, so I don't do gardens. But if you've ever planted a seed, the seed itself is put into the soil. And that seed decays. and turns into a plant that has roots and a stem, and it reaches and breaks through the soil and reaches for the sun. All the while, the form continues to change. The seedling no longer is its seed, it becomes a sapling, and then eventually into a tree. All of that occurs in nature on the physical realm. So I like the idea that it's a transition of form. Now, Isaac Bentoff, who is the author of the Stalking the Wild Pendulum. Oh, I forgot my pendulum. Anyway, Isaac Bentoff, he says this. I really like this idea. Our senses, my 5 senses, which are connected to the physical realm, translate physical reality into a Morse code, he calls it, action and rest. Beautiful illustration of life and death, action and rest. This is our subjective reality. We can compare this action and rest language to the motion of a pendulum or an oscillator. When the pendulum reaches the point of rest, so if you've ever seen a pendulum, it swings. When it goes to one end and swings, according to Bentoff, in that moment, the velocity has to stop. It ceases its action, and for a split second, it no longer exists. And then it swings back into the other motion. So when the pendulum reaches its point of rest, it has become non-material for a short period of time. Thank you. It's become non-material for a short period of time. And then it expands into space at an almost infinite velocity. Now, there's so much science that goes to this. I don't want to go that deep into it, but he says a quote from a Tibetan Buddhist book suggests that it's a tangible world is movement. So in the tangible world, we have movement. Without change or movement, there is no objective or subjective reality. Now, this makes sense to me. Without movement, there is no physical existence. We die. Our body must continue to move. So according to Bentoff, this is George's pocket watch. According to Bentoff, when we swing from action to rest. So in this split second, right there, when it reaches there, it's a split second. You can't even measure it or see it by the naked eye. This doesn't exist anymore. It stops and then returns back to another. So there's a transition of form. That's what it really comes down to. He's speaking of the transition of form, which Torkham talks about as well. Now, going to the benefits of contemplating our mortality, excuse me. Mortality. There's a number of people that I have known personally that have had an incurable disease. Whether it's 4th stage lymphoma, cancer that's spread throughout the body, liver cancer, most of them are cancer. But the people that I know, when they discovered they had a disease, they went through the typical trials and tribulations, the treatments and the suggestions. Some people go holistic, some people go the pharmaceutical manner. No judgment there. But I have experience with the people that I know. It's been about 4, I think. Every time these people reach the place that the treatment doesn't work anymore and there's nothing else anyone can do, pray or acceptance. Once these people have reached this place, they find an acceptance of their mortality. And in that moment, they find peace. It's almost as if they glow. They're excited because they know they're about to go on another adventure. Now, I don't know if this is endorphins kicking in because it wants to help you prep for death, or if they really have reached a place where there's nothing to be afraid of, because there's nothing you really can do, so there's nothing to be afraid of. I've seen these people, they literally have a glow about them. They laugh more, they smile more, they worry less. Things don't seem to get to them. One person in particular decided to go on a large vacation and not pay his bills, but that was, his choice. But they wanted to experience life more. They took risks more. They embraced their loved ones more. They cherished their moments more. Every single one of them, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the experiences. Every single person. It wasn't about the money. It was about their experiences. They attempted to enrich not only their life, but the lives of the people in their life, the lives of their loved ones. I found it quite beautiful. As I said, they took more risks, they embraced more. Oh, They cleaned up their unfinished business. Most of them cleaned up their unfinished business. So when it came time for death, they truly were peaceful, completely and truly peaceful. One woman I know, she had an 8-year-old daughter and she was dying of cancer. So they would have long discussions with the daughter. And as a matter of fact, the daughter chose who she wanted to go live with. She didn't want to live with grandma and grandpa. She went and lived with one of her, not even a family friend. It was a family friend. It wasn't even a family member. But having that 8-year-old daughter have that conversation, she wasn't afraid. She was kind of happy for her mom that she wouldn't be in pain anymore, and that she would be passed on and things were taken care of. I found that to be so beautiful. I was in my 20s when I experienced that, and I was just so moved that a mom can have a conversation with her 8-year-old daughter about death, and it wasn't fearful. It really was like matter-of-factly and joyously. The way she presented it was so beautiful. It really made an impact on me. Now, some people who've had near-death experiences, they have the same outlook. It's as if they have a new experience, a new expression of life, a new look, a new opportunity to change things. So some people, after they've had near-death experiences, they actually do the same things. They're more embracing in life, they take more risks, they worry less, they love more. Not everybody, but some people do that. Now, I've had several near-death experiences. I've spoken about that before. Most of them happened when I was a child. So I didn't really comprehend what was going on. I couldn't understand. I didn't see a white light or a tunnel. And what I did experience, and I didn't experience fear. That was my number one thing. No fear. I did experience being above my body and looking down. And it's like watching a movie. Oh, look what's happening. Okay. And then I remember talking, I was surrounded by people. And even though I couldn't see them, I knew they were there and they were very familiar. It's like having a conversation with a best friend. Very, very familiar. And, you know, when they said to me, well, you have to go back, I didn't struggle. I didn't get upset. It was like, oh, okay, no big deal. And then I returned back. I just drew my attention back to my body and boom, I'm back in my body. Now, as I said, as a child, I didn't really comprehend that. So it's not like I said, oh, I'm going to live life better now, because I didn't really know what happened. I didn't understand what happened. Years later, as an adult, when I looked back on each one of those individual experiences, I went, oh my gosh. And that would explain, it does explain a lot about me though. I am a person who's not afraid of death. And I don't know if it's because I've been there or I've had the experiences of watching other people. I don't know. I have a tendency to believe it's because I've had those near-death experiences and there's nothing to be afraid of. My fear is quite different. I fear the non-existence part. That has nothing to do with death. It has the idea of the soul itself never existing. It's a different topic. But anyway, the concept of death, this physical body dying and transitioning, my soul goes to another. I believe in reincarnation. So yeah, not a problem. You know, I was Cleopatra like everybody else was. Just kidding. So anyway, when it comes to death, naturally, my favorite story about George is when he died. His passing was probably one of the most beautiful things I experienced with him. I have learned a great deal of information and knowledge and lessons from George. But the experience of being there when he passed away, one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced in my life. Now, George was very passionate about befriending death, very passionate. He would sit, he would meditate, he'd visualize the casket, he'd visualize his heart start beating and stop beating. He'd visualize all of these. If you knew George, you knew he was terrified of death as a child. As a young child, he grew up in the back hills of West Virginia. And back then, the deaths and the births all happened in the house you lived in. So you were born in the house you lived in, and you died in the house you lived in. So many times people, when they died, the people would just be laid out in the living room, and you could cry and cry. It was actually encouraged to wail and cry, and there'd be a celebration for 2-3 days, and then, you know, put the body in the ground and whatnot. I don't know if 2-3 days is accurate, but there was a celebration. So on this one particular day, George said he wasn't very old, maybe 6 years old. He was walking with his mom. It was a dreary, rainy day. And you could, as they're approaching the house, you could hear the women wailing and crying and sobbing. Now, remember the pictures I talked to you about death? So here you are, a dreary, gray day in the woods with wailing and screaming. Naturally, that sets up a picture of fear. So there's wailing and screaming going on, and what had happened is they were bringing the body back to the house it was born in. I don't remember why, but so the casket was in the back of a pickup truck, and back then the pickup trucks didn't have the end to it. It was just the two guardrails on the side, and it was a hilly area. So as George is approaching this funeral, he's holding his mom's hand, and the pickup truck comes up and you hear people crying and screaming, and at that moment the car hits a bump, the truck hits a bump, and the casket slides out. It hits the mud and starts sliding down the hill towards George. Now, his mom must have known something was happening, because he remembers going very weak in the knees, and he felt very faint, and the next thing he knew, he felt like he was flying. What had occurred is his mom grabbed his hand, turned, and ran as far as she could. She took him away from that. So George never got to see the outcome of what had happened. Therefore, at 6 years old, he became very afraid of death. Something bad must have happened. That's why Mom took me away. So he spent most of his childhood, adolescent, teen years, into his 20s and 30s, terrified of death. So much so, he was a minister. When he had to deliver the eulogy at a funeral, he couldn't do it. He would look up and not look at the casket. He would do everything he could to pass and go around, not even touch the casket. He wouldn't look at the body. He would look at the people, and he refused to see the casket. And when he had to bless it, he would do it far. He was terrified. Now, of course, when he started doing Omega and recognizing this isn't the life he wanted to live, he didn't want to be afraid of death, that's when he started embracing death. He started visualizing it, recognizing it's a part of life, and befriending it. Because, like he said, he wanted to make it be that when he passed, it wasn't fearful, it was joyful. Which brings me back to the moment when he passed. I don't want to tell the whole story. I've told this a number of times. But what I do want to say is I really believe George chose the moment to die. His granddaughter was with me, and we were the only two in the room. I'm going to cry on this one. His granddaughter was with me. Now, the important part of this is his granddaughter, when she was 9 years old, had a tumor. She almost died. George was with her by her side. And they were buddies. That's what they called each other, buddy. Hey, buddy, how you doing? So when I first met her, she was 12 years old when I first met her. They had a very dynamic and beautiful relationship. Now, because of this tumor and the cancer, she went through treatments and surgeries, and it was a few years to get it under control. Every 6 months, she had to get checked to make sure she didn't have cancer. Every headache sent her into the fear of the cancer's back, because it was a tumor in her brain. She had a brain tumor. Now, in addition to that fear of the cancer returning, when a child has cancer, the American Cancer Society actually has cancer camps for children of cancer, survivors of cancer, and the family members. So her sister used to go to camp, and then she would go to camp. When she first went, she really enjoyed it. But then what happened is she started going to camp. It was up in Prescott, I believe. Every time she'd go back, one of her friends didn't return because they died, because the cancer returned. So there was one time she went, there was like several kids that didn't come back because they died. And this began to increase the fear in her that the cancer's going to come back, she's going to die. And knowing her friend's not there at a very early age, when nobody really explains death to you, somebody doesn't show back up, they're gone. And that sort of made an impact on her. She stopped going to cancer camp. She didn't want to do it anymore. And that began to develop the fear of death. So by the time she was 14, she was thoroughly terrified of death, thoroughly. Now, as I said, I met her when I was 12, not afraid of death, a child terrified of death. So I would try to take her on risks and stuff like that. She would do risks, but still very afraid of death. Now, fast forward. Here we are, the day George dies. And the reason why I think he chose it, because she was with us. She was standing right there with me. As a matter of fact, when he opened his eyes the first time, because we thought he was going to go, he popped open his eyes, glowing, very happy, the biggest smile, looking directly at her. That's when I knew the signal was he was trying to talk to her. She's holding his hand, sobbing, "Grandpa, don't go, don't go, don't go." And then something happened. I cannot explain it fully. But again, it's one of those moments where time kind of slows down, and it's as if you could feel George speaking to her. He couldn't talk. He hadn't eaten or drank anything in 7 days. His tongue was so swollen. But it's like his presence was washing over her. I know this sounds so goofy. His presence was washing over her and saying it's okay. It's like he was telling her death isn't bad. It's okay. And I watched this because he's looking at her and I've got the two of them in my view. And she's holding his hand, "Don't go," sobbing, "Don't go." And all of a sudden, she stopped. Now, he did close his eyes, and when he opened his eyes the second time, briefly he closed, and when he opened his eyes the second time, she had a completely different outlook. She smiled, and she said, "Grandpa, it's okay, I love you, you can go." And now, here's the kid, "Don't go. Go, Grandpa, go." So it's like we're two cheerleaders. "It's okay, you can go. That was so beautiful to witness, the transition. And as far as I'm aware, I remember her saying, "That wasn't so bad." "And isn't Grandpa happy now that he's not here?" "Yeah, honey, he's not in pain anymore." And she's like, oh, like it gave her a new perspective on death. Now, here's my point. Had George not spent all that time preparing for death, embracing death, being friends with death, that outcome may have been entirely different. But he used his death, as George would, in a lesson to teach her it's okay to die, to befriend death. I think that was so beautiful. And again, as I said, I felt so blessed on being there to experience that moment. So when it comes to the contemplation of our death, I would really encourage you to spend some time every day, just a few minutes, doesn't have to be long, just a few minutes to contemplate your mortality, to contemplate your death itself. How would you like to go? Where would you like to go? What would you like to do? I think by recognizing our mortality, we actually experience freedom. It gives us the freedom to be and cherish the moments so much more than out of the, "I'll get to it later, I'll get to it later, I'll get to it later." Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate this. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Monday night workshop, which will be in 2 weeks, I believe. Remember, we have an Omega 1 starting this Friday. If you're interested, or if you know anybody that's interested, please have them go to www.omegavector.org to register. Have a good night. Thank you now.